June 23, 1942. The sky over the Bristol Channel is overcast, heavy with the kind of oppressive gray that has come to define wartime Britain. At Royal Air Force Pembrey, a coastal airfield in South Wales, ground crews are going about their routine maintenance when a peculiar sound cuts through the afternoon air. It is the deep, guttural roar of an aircraft engine, but not the familiar Merlin whine of a Spitfire or the steady rumble of a hurricane. This sound is different, rawer, more powerful. Men look up, squinting against the clouds, and what they see makes their blood run cold. A single-engine fighter is descending toward the runway, its broad cowling and distinctive radial engine unmistakable. It is a Focke-Wulf 190, Germany's newest and most feared fighter, and it is landing at their airfield with its landing gear down, as casually as if returning from a training flight. The ground crews freeze. Some scatter for cover, certain this must be the prelude to an attack, that bombs will soon follow or machine guns will rake the tarmac. But the aircraft simply touches down, bounces once on the grass strip, and rolls to a stop. The propeller winds down, the canopy slides back, and a young Luftwaffe pilot, wearing the gray-green uniform of the German Air Force, climbs out and stands on the wing, looking around with what can only be described as confusion. For a moment, the entire airfield holds its breath. Then the realization dawns on both sides simultaneously. The pilot has made a catastrophic error. He thinks he has landed in France. Instead, he has delivered Nazi Germany's most closely guarded aerial weapon directly into the hands of the British Royal Air Force. In that single moment of disorientation, Oberleutnant Armin Faber has changed the course of the air war. He does not know it yet, standing there on the wing of his pristine Focke-Wulf, still catching his breath from the flight. He does not know that within hours, British intelligence officers will be examining every rivet and wire of his aircraft. He does not know that test pilots will soon push this machine to its limits, mapping its strengths and exposing its weaknesses. He does not know that the information gleaned from his mistake will save hundreds, perhaps thousands of Allied lives. All he knows is that something has gone terribly, irrevocably wrong. To understand the magnitude of this error, we must return to the months before, to the winter and spring of 1942, when a new terror appeared in the skies over France and the English Channel. For 2 years, the Royal Air Force had fought the Luftwaffe to a standstill. The Spitfire and Hurricane had become symbols of British defiance during the Battle of Britain, their performances nearly matching the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. Pilots on both sides had developed a grudging respect for their adversaries. The contest was relatively even, determined more by tactics, numbers, and the skill of individual pilots than by overwhelming technical superiority on either side. But in September of 1941, everything changed. RAF pilots returning from missions over occupied France began reporting encounters with a new German fighter, one that seemed to possess capabilities beyond anything they had faced before. It was faster than the Spitfire Mark V, the Royal Air Force's frontline fighter. It could outclimb them. Most terrifyingly, it could roll at speeds that seemed almost impossible, flicking from one defensive position to another before British pilots could track it in their gun sights. The aircraft was the Focke-Wulf 190, and within weeks of its operational debut, it had established a reign of terror over the Channel and northern France. Flight Lieutenant J.E. Johnny Johnson, one of Britain's most skilled fighter pilots, later wrote that his first encounter with the F-190 left him feeling comprehensively outclassed. This was not the modest admission of a timid flyer. Johnson would eventually be credited with 38 aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring British ace to survive the war. Yet even he recognized immediately that the Spitfire Mark V was hopelessly outmatched. Other pilots reported similar experiences. The Focke-Wulf seemed to appear from nowhere, make a single devastating pass, and vanish before the RAF fighters could respond. British losses mounted. Squadron morale began to deteriorate. Some pilots privately questioned whether they could continue to contest the skies against this new predator. The aircraft had been designed by Kurt Tank, one of Germany's most gifted aeronautical engineers, and it represented a fundamentally different philosophy from the Messerschmitt 109. Where the 109 used a liquid-cooled inline engine, sleek and narrow, the FW-190 employed a massive BMW radial engine, 14 cylinders arranged in 2 rows around a central crankshaft. This gave the aircraft an almost brutish appearance, its broad nose making it look heavier and less elegant than its British opponents. But appearances were deceiving. The radial engine was immensely powerful, producing 1,700 horsepower, and it was far more resistant to battle damage than a liquid-cooled engine. A single bullet through a coolant line could disable a Spitfire's Merlin engine within minutes. The FW-190's radial could absorb considerable punishment and keep running. Tank had also solved one of the fundamental problems of radial engine fighters. Traditionally, such aircraft suffered from poor pilot visibility because the large engine blocked the forward view during takeoff and landing. Tank addressed this by mounting the cockpit far back on the fuselage and giving the aircraft a long nose, which improved ground handling. He also equipped it with an exceptionally wide-track landing gear that made it stable on rough airfields and far less prone to ground accidents than the narrow-gear Messerschmitt. For Luftwaffe pilots, this meant they could operate from forward airfields closer to the combat zone, reducing transit time and increasing operational flexibility. But the most revolutionary aspect of the FW-190 was its control system. Tank had recognized that as aircraft speeds increased, the physical forces on control surfaces became enormous. Pilots had to exert tremendous strength to maneuver at high speeds, and in the stress of combat, this could be fatiguing and dangerous. To address this, Tank designed an electrically assisted control system that reduced the physical effort required to move the ailerons, the wing-mounted surfaces that controlled roll. The result was an aircraft that could roll faster than anything else in the sky. In a dogfight, where survival often depended on rapid changes of direction, this was a decisive advantage. An FW-190 pilot could roll into a defensive position or line up a shot before an opponent could react. By the spring of 1942, the aircraft had been in operational service for 6 months, and its impact on the air war was undeniable. RAF Fighter Command was desperately seeking ways to counter the threat. Intelligence officers pored over reconnaissance photographs, trying to glean details about the aircraft's construction. Pilots who had survived encounters with the FW-190 were extensively debriefed, their observations compiled into tactical reports. But this was all indirect information, filtered through the fog of combat. What the RAF needed was the aircraft itself, intact and flyable, so that test pilots and engineers could discover its precise capabilities and, more importantly, its weaknesses. Getting such an aircraft seemed nearly impossible. The Luftwaffe guarded its new fighter jealously. FW-190s were based at airfields deep in occupied France, far from any potential British commando raid. Damaged aircraft were quickly salvaged or destroyed to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. The British considered elaborate schemes to capture one. Could a fast boat intercept a damaged FW-190 forced to ditch in the channel? Could agents in France somehow steal one from an airfield? Every scenario seemed implausible, bordering on fantasy, and yet the need was urgent. Every day without this intelligence meant more RAF pilots were dying, shot down by an enemy they did not fully understand. Into this desperate situation stepped Oberleutnant Armin Faber, though he had no intention of becoming a footnote in history. Faber was 21 years old, a competent, if not exceptional pilot assigned to Jägerschwader II, a veteran fighter unit based at Morlix in Brittany. On the morning of June 23rd, his unit was tasked with escorting a formation of German bombers attacking targets in southwest England. It was a routine mission, the kind that Faber and his comrades had flown dozens of times. The FW-190 pilots would accompany the bombers across the channel, fend off any British fighters that attempted to intercept, and then return to base. Simple, straightforward, and relatively safe, provided one followed procedures and stayed with the formation. But combat is never as simple as briefings suggest. As the German formation crossed the English coast, British fighters appeared. Spitfires from RAF squadrons stationed in Cornwall and Devon climbed to intercept. And the sky over the Bristol Channel erupted into a confused melee of twisting aircraft, tracer fire, and shouted radio calls. Faber engaged a pair of Spitfires, his wingman somewhere in the chaos behind him. He fired, missed, rolled hard to evade return fire, and found himself momentarily alone. The bombers had turned for home. The other fighters, both British and German, had scattered. Below him, through breaks in the clouds, he could see coastline and green fields. He needed to rejoin his unit or, failing that, navigate back to France independently. This was the critical moment, the juncture where a small error would cascade into catastrophe. Faber was over the Bristol Channel, the broad estuary that separates southern Wales from southwest England. The channel runs roughly east to west, with the Welsh coast on the northern side and the English coast on the south. To return to France, Faber needed to fly south, cross the English coast, and then head southeast across the channel to Brittany. But in the confusion of combat and the disorientation of aerobatic maneuvering, Faber made a fundamental navigational mistake. He had lost track of which direction he was facing. He believed he was over the English Channel and needed to turn toward France. In reality, he was over the Bristol Channel, and when he turned what he thought was south toward home, he was actually turning north, deeper into Wales. Pilots are trained to guard against such errors. Compass headings, the position of the sun, the shape of coastlines all provide clues to orientation. But in the stress of combat, with adrenaline surging and attention focused on immediate threats, it is possible to become disoriented, especially when flying at low altitude where the horizon may be obscured. Faber flew north, confident he was heading home. Below him, the green fields and small towns looked much like Brittany. There was no obvious indication he was flying in the wrong direction. After several minutes, his fuel gauge reminded him that he needed to land soon. He had been airborne for nearly 2 hours, much of that time at high throttle settings during combat. The FW-190, for all its strengths, was not a long-range aircraft. Its fuel capacity was limited, and Faber was approaching the point where he would not have enough remaining to search for his home airfield. He needed to land immediately. Looking down, he spotted an airfield. It appeared military, with grass runways and several buildings that looked like hangars. To Faber, this seemed perfectly normal. He assumed he was over Brittany and that this was either his home field or a nearby Luftwaffe base. He circled once, saw no other aircraft in the pattern, and committed to landing. The gear came down with reassuring thumps. The flaps extended. He trimmed for approach speed and brought the FW-190 in smoothly, touching down and rolling out on the grass. Only as he slowed and began to taxi did he notice that something was wrong. The aircraft on the ground were not German. They were British, Spitfires. The buildings had RAF markings, and running toward his aircraft were men in British uniforms, some carrying rifles. For a few seconds, Faber considered attempting to take off again, but his fuel was critically low. He would not get far, and attempting to escape would only get him shot. There was no option but surrender. He shut down the engine, opened the canopy, and climbed out. An intelligence officer who interviewed him later reported that Faber seemed stunned, almost unable to process what had happened. He kept repeating that he had thought he was in France, that he could not understand how he had ended up in Wales. The British, for their part, could hardly believe their luck. Here, taxiing to a stop in front of them, was the aircraft they had been desperately trying to acquire for months. Not a wreck salvaged from a crash site, but a fully operational, undamaged FW-190, complete with ammunition, equipment, and even the pilot's personal effects. Within an hour, the aircraft was under armed guard. Within hours, it had been carefully examined by RAF ground crews, photographed from every angle, and prepared for transport. Within 2 days, it was at the Royal Aircraft Establishment in Farnborough, the center of British aeronautical research, where a team of engineers and test pilots waited to unlock its secrets. The British had captured enemy aircraft before, but never under such ideal circumstances. Usually they had to work with wreckage, trying to reconstruct how an aircraft had performed based on damaged or incomplete examples. Here they had a pristine machine, recently serviced, with a full technical manual in the cockpit and even maintenance logs that provided insight into the aircraft's operational history. The testing began immediately. The British assigned the captured aircraft the serial number MP499 and painted RAF roundels over the German crosses. Eric Winkle Brown, one of the Royal Navy's most experienced test pilots, was among the first to fly it. Brown had flown more types of aircraft than almost any pilot alive, and his assessments were considered authoritative. His first flight in the FW-190 confirmed everything the RAF pilots had reported and revealed much more. The aircraft was indeed faster than the Spitfire Mark V, with a top speed of approximately 400 miles per hour at medium altitude. It climbed faster, and its roll rate was extraordinary, far superior to any Allied fighter. Brown noted that the control harmony, the balance between aileron, elevator, and rudder inputs, was excellent at medium speeds. The aircraft felt responsive and predictable, qualities that made it easy to aim precisely in combat. The visibility from the cockpit was adequate, though not as good as the Spitfire's bubble canopy. The radial engine created a blind spot directly ahead, forcing the pilot to weave during taxiing and approach. But once airborne, the visibility was acceptable. The armament was also impressive. The FW-190 carried 2 machine guns in the cowling and 4 20mm cannons, 2 in the wing roots and 2 in the outer wings. This was a devastating battery, far heavier than the Spitfire's 8 rifle-caliber machine guns, or even the later cannon-arm versions. But as the testing continued, the British also began to discover the aircraft's weaknesses, and these were more significant than the Luftwaffe had realized or admitted. The first major vulnerability was altitude performance. The BMW radial engine, while powerful at low and medium altitudes, suffered from inadequate supercharging. Above 20,000 feet, the engine began to lose power rapidly. At 25,000 feet, the FW-190 was sluggish and unresponsive. The Spitfire Mark IX, which was just entering service with an improved Merlin engine, could outperform the FW-190 at these heights. This was a critical discovery because much of the air combat over Europe occurred at high altitude, where bomber formations operated and where escorting fighters needed to engage. The second weakness was sustained maneuverability. While the FW-190 could roll quickly, it could not turn as tightly as a Spitfire in a sustained turning fight. The British pilots discovered that if they could force an FW-190 into a prolonged turning engagement, the Spitfire's lower wing loading gave it an advantage. The German aircraft would be forced to either break off the engagement or accept an increasingly vulnerable position. This was crucial tactical intelligence. RAF pilots had been trying to match the FW-190's roll rate, attempting to outturn it in the vertical plane. Now they understood that the better tactic was to force horizontal turns, where the Spitfire's strengths could be leveraged. The third vulnerability was high-speed handling. At speeds above 400 miles per hour, the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy. The ailerons, which rolled so beautifully at medium speeds, became almost immovable at high speed. The elevator, which controlled pitch, also stiffened, making it difficult to pull out of a high-speed dive. British test pilots discovered that if an FW-190 pilot dove steeply to escape, he might find himself unable to pull out before reaching dangerously low altitude. This characteristic had killed several Luftwaffe pilots who had attempted aggressive diving attacks and found their aircraft unresponsive to their inputs. The British now understood that forcing an FW-190 into a high-speed dive could be a viable defensive tactic. The fourth issue was engine cooling. The BMW radial engine generated enormous heat, and the cooling system struggled to dissipate it during sustained high-power operation. In extended combat, the engine could overheat, forcing the pilot to reduce power and potentially leaving him vulnerable. The British noted that the engine temperature gauges in Faber's aircraft showed signs of chronic overheating, with discoloration around the cylinder heads. This suggested that the problem was endemic to the design, not merely a flaw in this particular aircraft. All of this information was compiled into detailed reports and distributed to RAF squadrons within weeks. Tactical bulletins were issued, instructing pilots on how to engage the FW-190 most effectively. Force engagements at high altitude where the German fighter's engine is less effective. If attacked, turn hard horizontally rather than attempting to match the FW-190's roll rate. If an FW-190 dives away, follow but do not attempt to close rapidly. Instead, maintain pursuit and force the German pilot into a position where he must either overheat his engine or accept combat at a disadvantage. These tactics worked. Within months of the capture of Faber's aircraft, RAF loss rates in combat with the FW-190 began to decline. British pilots reported feeling more confident, more willing to engage rather than evade, but the impact of the captured aircraft extended far beyond tactical adjustments. The intelligence was shared with the United States Army Air Forces, which was building up its fighter strength in Britain in preparation for daylight bombing campaigns over Europe. American test pilots were invited to fly the FW-190 at Farnborough, and their conclusions shaped the development of American fighter tactics and aircraft design. The Americans were particularly interested in the high-altitude vulnerability. Their bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, operated at altitudes between 25 and 30,000 feet. If American fighters could engage German interceptors at these altitudes, the FW-190 would be at a significant disadvantage. This insight influenced the operational deployment of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which was just entering service with the 8th Air Force. The P-47 was a massive fighter, powered by a turbo-supercharged engine that excelled at high altitude. American commanders, informed by the intelligence from Faber's aircraft, decided to emphasize high-altitude escort missions, where the Thunderbolt's strengths and the FW-190's weaknesses would be most pronounced. This decision proved crucial. When American fighters began escorting bomber formations deep into Germany, they consistently forced German fighters to engage at altitudes where the FW-190 was compromised. The captured aircraft also influenced Allied aircraft design. British engineers studying the FW-190 were impressed by its wide-track landing gear, which made ground handling far safer than the narrow-gear Spitfire. This feature was incorporated into subsequent British fighter designs. The electrically assisted controls, while complex, demonstrated that future high-speed fighters would need power-assisted systems to remain controllable. This insight informed the development of post-war jet fighters, which universally adopted hydraulic or electric control assistance. The Germans, for their part, were slow to realize what had happened. The loss of Faber's aircraft was initially attributed to combat damage or mechanical failure, and it was only after British intelligence allowed carefully edited photographs of the captured FW-190 to be leaked through neutral channels that the Luftwaffe understood the magnitude of the breach. By then, it was too late. The intelligence had been disseminated, the tactics had been revised, and Allied pilots were already applying the lessons learned. The Luftwaffe attempted to address some of the vulnerabilities identified by the British, but fundamental limitations of the design could not be easily rectified. The BMW engine's altitude performance was constrained by the limits of contemporary supercharger technology. The control stiffness at high speed was a consequence of aerodynamic forces that could not be eliminated without a complete redesign. As for Oberleutnant Armin Faber, he spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner, interned in Canada. He was repatriated in 1947 and returned to Germany, where he lived quietly, rarely discussing his role in one of the war's most significant intelligence failures. In later years, when historians tracked him down and asked about the events of June 23, 1942, he maintained that it had been a simple navigational error, exacerbated by combat stress and disorientation. He had not been incompetent, merely unlucky. Perhaps this was true. Certainly, many pilots made similar errors during the war, and most were not punished by fate as severely as Faber. But the consequences of his mistake were undeniable. Historians have since debated the exact impact of the captured FW-190 on the course of the air war. Some argue that the Allies would have eventually developed effective counter-tactics through experience and attrition. Others contend that the intelligence provided by Faber's aircraft accelerated this process by months or even years, saving hundreds of Allied lives in the interim. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The capture of the aircraft did not single-handedly turn the tide of the air war, but it provided a crucial advantage at a moment when the Allies desperately needed one. What is certain is that the FW-190, for all its strengths, never again enjoyed the psychological dominance it had possessed in the spring of 1942. By late that year, improved British fighters like the Spitfire Mark IX had entered service, aircraft that could match or exceed the FW-190's performance. The Americans were deploying the P-47 Thunderbolt and later the P-51 Mustang, both of which proved superior at the high altitudes where the air war was increasingly fought. The German fighter, once a revolutionary design, became just another aircraft in a sky crowded with ever more capable machines. Kurt Tank, the FW-190's designer, continued to refine the aircraft throughout the war, producing variants with more powerful engines and improved high-altitude performance. The FW-190D model, introduced in 1944, used a liquid-cooled inline engine and could fight effectively at 30,000 feet. But by then, the Luftwaffe was overwhelmed by Allied numerical superiority and chronic fuel shortages. The technical excellence of individual aircraft could not compensate for the broader collapse of Germany's war effort. The captured FW-190, serial number MP-499, continued to be used for testing throughout the war. British pilots flew it in comparative trials against new Allied fighters, ensuring that each new type could effectively engage the German aircraft. American pilots trained against it, learning to recognize its silhouette and predict its maneuvers. It became a familiar sight at Farnborough, a trophy of war and a constant reminder of the value of intelligence. After the war, the aircraft was briefly displayed at an exhibition before being scrapped, its usefulness exhausted. Today, no photographs of the original aircraft in British markings are known to survive in public archives, though the technical reports and pilot assessments remain testimony to its significance. The broader lesson of Faber's mistake extends beyond the specific details of one aircraft or one war. It speaks to the fragility of technological advantage in warfare. The FW-190 represented a significant leap forward in fighter design, a synthesis of power, speed, and maneuverability that gave the Luftwaffe a crucial edge. But that edge depended on secrecy, on the enemy's ignorance of the aircraft's capabilities, and, more importantly, its limitations. Once that secrecy was breached, once the Allies could examine and test the aircraft, the advantage evaporated. Knowledge is as potent a weapon as any gun or engine. In intelligence work, a single error, a single compromise, can unravel years of effort and investment. For the pilots who flew against the FW-190 in those desperate months of early 1942, the capture of Faber's aircraft was nothing short of salvation. They had been sent into combat against an enemy they did not understand, with tactics that did not work, watching their friends die in unequal contests. The intelligence from the captured aircraft gave them a fighting chance. It did not make the war easy or safe, but it made victory possible. In the calculus of war, where survival often depends on the smallest margins, this was everything. June 23, 1942. A young German pilot, disoriented and low on fuel, makes a turn that should have taken him home. Instead, it takes him into history, not as a hero, but as the man who gave away the war. In the years since, military historians have studied his error, using it as a case study in navigation, stress management, and the importance of situational awareness. Pilots are taught to double-check their headings, to never trust their instincts over their instruments, to always know where they are. But the lesson goes deeper than technique. War is chaos, and chaos breeds error. Sometimes those errors are inconsequential, forgotten as soon as they occur. And sometimes they change everything. The sky over Pembrey airfield is quiet now. The grass runways long since paved over and repurposed for civilian use. No monuments mark the spot where Faber landed. No plaques commemorate the moment when the course of the air war shifted. But the impact of that moment ripples forward still, in the tactics taught to fighter pilots, in the design principles embedded in modern aircraft, in the understanding that intelligence, not merely firepower, determines the outcome of conflicts. One aircraft, one pilot, one mistake, and the war was never the same.